Welcome to the Philosophemes channel. In this seminar, we ask the question, what is hyper-reality? I've put together for you this 7 ways to understand hyper-reality. I feel as though this is very helpful because a number of the videos that are available regarding hyper-reality just don't seem to get clear enough, in my opinion. So the first way to understand hyperreality is to ask this question, what is the value of a sign? And we can compare modernism and postmodernism to help us understand hyperreality in the postmodern period. Next, we will look at the relation between the actual and the virtual. This is relatively high-level philosophy, but I think that we can make it communicable here. Next, we'll look at hyper-real art. And I've made reference to this in a number of other episodes, but we're going to look at it here specifically as a way to understand hyper-reality. Next, we're going to look at the celebrated distinction between a map and the territory to which it's supposed to refer. Next, we'll look at hyper-reality and the perfect crime. This is a concept that comes out of Jean Baudrillard also, and he also has a book of collected essays titled this. Then these last 2 examples, we will look at what I call the treadmill example and the final solution. Again, both of these ideas come out of Jean Baudrillard. As many of us know or should know by now, that Jean Baudrillard is the philosopher behind The Matrix. And there's a scene in The Matrix, the first Matrix movie, where they pay homage to Jean Baudrillard by showing the book that he wrote that is primarily behind the movie The Matrix. And so you can see here on this slide the scene, the white rabbit hole scene, in which Neo pulls a copy of Simulacra and Simulation off of the shelf. Of the many places where Baudrillard wrote about hyperreality, we're going to be focusing on Simulacra and Simulation, The Perfect Crime, Seduction, The Illusion of the End, America, The Vital Illusion, Art and Artifact, and Symbolic Exchange and Death. It's interesting to note that Jean Baudrillard on page 7 of Simulacra and Simulation also refers to hyperreality as neo-reality. Hyperreality may be understood by thinking about how reality is supposed to be anchored in postmodernity. Modernism thinks of material instantiation as the anchor or ground of reality. Postmodernism thinks of social consensus as the anchor or ground of reality. The virtual and the actual. Written in 1991, in The Gulf War Did Not Take Place, Jean Baudrillard claimed, quote, "We are no longer in a logic of the passage from the virtual to the actual, but in a hyper-realist logic of the deterrence of the real by the virtual." That is a very complicated statement. So let's try to unpack it and see if we can understand it. So this is one of my favorite examples. I used this example in my very first book, the first edition of Full Throttle Heart. The color blue, or the idea of the color blue as a regulative idea. So if you get the idea of the color blue in your mind, right, then it becomes possible for you to look around the environment and use this idea to regulate your relation to the environment. For example, you can look around the environment right now and you can pick out all of the things in the environment that are the color blue. All right, so that's an example of using an idea in a regulative way. All of this is coming from Immanuel Kant, by the way, especially from his book, The Critique of the Power of Judgment. So we can make a distinction between the regulative versus the determinative use of judgment. The regulative versus the determinative use of judgment. For example, in regard to the modern period, it is possible for us to go out and have an actual experience. For example, an actual experience of the environment. Once we have an actual experience of the environment, then we can use our concepts to understand the environment, and then we can formulate an idea about that environment that we just experienced. Now, the environment that we just experienced is actual. The idea that we formulated is virtual. Now, what happens is that we can then use our virtual idea that we developed from actual experience. We can use that virtual idea in a regulative way regarding future experience. So, just like we used the idea of the color blue in a regulative way when we looked around and picked out all the blue items in the environment around us, we can do the same thing with this idea that we have formulated from actual experience. So, for example, if I have an experience in which placing something in a certain part of the refrigerator causes me to forget that it's there, then I can formulate this idea of a better place to put the item in the refrigerator, and then regulate my behavior of putting that item in the refrigerator so that in the future I won't put it someplace and forget where I've put it. Notice the importance here is this flow from actual to virtual and then virtual back to actual. We use the virtual idea to regulate our behavior then in regard to actual reality. Now, in postmodernity, the first step is eliminated. So in postmodernity, we take a virtual idea and we take this idea because we like this idea. But by starting with the virtual idea and not starting with actual experience and developing a virtual idea, by starting with a virtual idea, when we then take that virtual idea and try to regulate our behavior in relation to actual reality, we find ourselves getting into all sorts of problems and illusions. This is relating to hyperreality. It seems to me that it's not possible to really accomplish this without some form of technological mediation. I really believe that it is essential in understanding how one can get to hyperreality, how one can get to a relation to hyperreality instead of reality. Now, in regard to Trompe-l'œil art and this idea of the falling down of the eye or the fooling of the eye. So I've mentioned this, I've talked about this in other places, but again, quickly here, Trompe-l'œil art is two-dimensional art that appears to be three-dimensional. So it is an illusion. Just as Trompe-l'œil art deceives the eye into seeing 3D, even though the actual real image is 2D, postmodernity treats hyperreality as reality. So looking back to the previous two slides, we could say something like, we take this virtual idea that was not developed from actual experience, but we like this virtual idea. We then use this virtual idea to regulate our relation to actual reality, such that then the experience that we're having is an experience of hyperreality, right? This, of course, is accomplished by way of some kind of mediation, whether it be technological or chemical mediation, in order to experience actual reality as hyperreality. By way of technological mediation, then, we are able to trompe-l'œil a postmodern self. And I feel as though if you can understand that sentence, then there is this tremendous light that should turn on for you, right? This tremendous light by way of which you can sort of look around at what's going on in postmodernity and start to see it for what it actually is. So it's important to point out, though, that the postmodern self is not real. The postmodern self is hyper-real, right? The postmodern self is an understanding of the self regulated by a virtual idea that is not grounded in actuality. And also, it's the case that the postmodern self depends upon a kind of mediation. So we can use the idea, the virtual idea of the postmodern self in order to relate to ourselves and in order to relate to the environment and to others. But we don't want to lose sight of the technological mediation that is necessary in order to use this virtual idea as a regulative idea. I like this. You can see the Trompe-l'œil art, chalk art. I have the reference here. But so when you look at the Trompe-l'œil art from one point of view, from one direction, this is what you see. When you look at the Trompe-l'œil art from another direction, this is what you see. So in a sense, what I'm trying to do in this seminar is to show you postmodernity from the point of view of the other side. So this is the celebrated example of the map and the territory. And I'm not going to read this to you, but you can read it. It'll be on screen. All you have to do is pause it and read it if you'd like. But what we can see here is this idea of a story in which we start to create a map for a territory, and then the map becomes so real that the map then takes over the territory. So the idea here then, of course, is that by relating to the map and not relating to the territory, then suddenly you are relating to hyperreality instead of reality. Baudrillard references this passage at the very beginning of Simulacra and Simulation, so the book that heavily influenced The Matrix, calling it the most beautiful allegory of simulation. And, I'm not saying that you should or shouldn't do anything, right? I'm just saying that this is the evolution of what's happening here. If you look around in postmodernity and you wonder, how did we get here? And do we want to keep going further? Do we want to change it? In any way, shape, or form? What are we looking at, right? And it seems to me that Baudrillard is correct in regard to hyperreality and postmodernity, that this is the world that we're living in now, right? As you begin to relate more and more to the map instead of the territory, that you are relating to hyperreality instead of reality. And as you are regulating your decisions and as you are regulating your actions in relation to hyperreality, you are then living in a simulation. This is the argument, that you're living in a simulation instead of living in reality. Now, there's a lot of ways to complicate these sorts of things and to try to muddy the water. But what we're trying to do right now is we're trying to get clear on what is hyperreality. So let's just stay on this line of thought. What is hyperreality? So we've looked at the actual and the virtual. We looked at Trompe-l'œil art. Now we're looking at the distinction between the map and the territory. This comes also out of Simulacra and Simulation. I have the transparent background slide here so that you can directly get the reference to the two other videos where I use this, the video on humanism, transhumanism, and posthumanism, and the video on function, narration, and simulation. So here we have this from representation of reality to hyper-real simulation. So we can see, according to Baudrillard, the four phases of relations to the image. And in the first phase here, the image is a representation of reality. So we can say that it is a sign for or a reflection of reality. And that the image, when we understand an image that way, the image is understood in the order or as in terms of the order of the good image. And notice in the background then that this would be to consider reality in an absolute way, right? Just like we considered human in an absolute way in the humanism talk. All right, so secondly, the second phase here then, the image masks and denatures reality. Notice that this is the first in the level of the relative as opposed to the absolute, in that Baudrillard refers to this as the order of the evil image. So the representation that we have of reality is a kind of mask of reality whenever we consider reality to be something that is relative. Again, I'm not pushing any of these points of views. I'm trying to show you the game board, right? I'm trying to show you what all of these positions look like, what all of these points of view look like, and then on the one hand, you can take whatever position you want to take, but philosophically speaking, you can move around in from all of these different points of view and look at the panorama, as it were. Okay, The image then in the next phase, the image masks the absence of a profound reality. So notice that the first phase in the relative is that the image masks reality. And the second phase in the relative is the image masks that there is no reality, right? So here we have the order of sorcery. So we've gone from, in the absolute, the order of the good image, in the relative, the order of the evil image, and now the order of sorcery. And notice that this is right there at the cusp as we are leaving a relative conception of reality and entering into a nihilistic conception of reality. So what happens as we enter into this fourth phase of the image and this nihilistic understanding of reality? According to Baudrillard, the image has no relation to any reality whatsoever, a sign without a real reference. It is its own pure simulacrum, the order of simulation. So, this is why, in a postmodern simulation, sign value can be treated as more important than use or exchange value, and consensus as more important than actuality. So again, we're saying the same thing over and over again. These are 7 different ways to understand hyperreality. But I think by the time we get through number 7, then we have a deeper understanding of hyperreality and postmodernity. Okay, so in regard to the map and the territory, here are a couple more quotes from Baudrillard that I think are important enough to read to you. He says, quote, "Let us be clear. If the real is disappearing, it is not because of a lack of it. On the contrary, there is too much of it. It is the excess of reality that puts an end to reality, just as the excess of information puts an end to information, or the excess of communication puts an end to communication. We are no longer living in a logic of the passage from the virtual to actual, but in a hyper-realist logic of the deterrence of the real by the virtual." So you can see here that there is some sense in which, as you relate to hyperreality, especially as we get to the second phase of a relative conception of reality, or to the fourth phase, which is the nihilistic conception of reality. Notice that we could say that by relating to the hyper-reality, there is some sense in which the actual reality is being neglected, right? This is an extremely heavy idea. I have a whole nother presentation on just that idea, so we'll talk about it there. But so what we see here is, again, this further explication of the distinction between the map and the territory. So then lastly, in regard to the map and the territory, this is also known as the technoscientific regulation of human life. So we take the map, the technoscientific image of a human, to be what the territory, the human, actually is. This becomes full-on posthumanism, full-on simulation, full-on postmodernism, when we take the map as the only hyperreality by suggesting the old image of the human was just superstitious ignorance. All right, so if that's the fourth way, I just want to make a comment here about the philosophical logic involved. And I think that it's very important to understand that this is what's operating in the background. So mind external reality is the thing in experience. The logic here is actually very straightforward and simple. Despite all the complexity involved in the vocabularies, and despite all the different possible contextualizations, there are only 3 categories into which the relations fit. 1, the relation between reality and the representation of reality in experience is absolute. 2, it is relative. Or 3, it is nihilistic, meaning that it is nothing, or there is no thing that is being experienced. So we can, and we will, talk about this and revisit it in other places, I'm sure, because it is the philosophical logic that's operating in the background. All right, so number 5 then. hyperreality as the perfect crime, postmodernism as the context capital needs to continue to expand itself. For example, everyone is equal, that is, everyone is equally just one more consumer. Pop culture is a factory which produces goods, and the culture industry functions like religion in prior stages. That is, to make workers more docile and less resistant to exploitation. So the guiding question here that would be helpful is for us to ask something like, how is it possible to promote consumerism? And one of the ways that it's possible to promote consumerism is to encourage people to think of themselves as consumers. If the postmodern self, if we could get people to think of themselves, to have a virtual idea of themselves, a virtual idea of what it means to live and to exist, if we can influence that idea, and because it's virtual, we may be able to influence it by way of consensus, peer pressure, consensus, as opposed to developing a virtual idea out of actual experience, right? If we are able to influence this virtual idea and we are able to get people to live and regulate their behaviors in accordance with this virtual idea, then people are relating to a hyperreal self and a hyperreal world, a hyperreal environment. Now, by thinking of yourself as this hyperreal entity, it becomes possible to get a person to consume more goods than they might otherwise consume. So this is the way in which Baudrillard talks about the perfect crime. Because you might ask, well, what's the problem with having a virtual idea of yourself as opposed to, and relating to hyperreality as opposed to relating to reality? And one of the ways that we could articulate that this is problematic is we could ask something like, well, who benefits? Who gains from this, right? Is there some sort of an agency or some sort of an entity out there that benefits by promoting or motivating you to think of yourself in a way that depends upon something that they are selling you? So this is the idea that pop culture, for example, functions like a religion. So we could say, consider the promotion of commodities ostensibly not for profit, but rather for the sake of justice. And, I always come back to this example because I just think it's so funny. Someone wrote this review of the Wonder Woman movie. They said, Wonder Woman was supposed to end racism and sexism and pay off my student loans. Instead, all it did was entertain me. Okay, so if we think about this then in terms of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, notice you can see that objects and events are unique and sign systems strive to copy them in the pre-modern period. In the modern period, mechanical and technological reproduction call the relation between simulation and basic reality into question, since the accuracy of the copy allows it to replace the original. That's the modern. Postmodern, then, the simulacrum, the copy, precedes the original. Right? Think of this virtual idea of the self as being treated as though it's more primordial than the actual self. Precedes the original, annihilating the original distinction between the copy and the original. So this is at the bottom of that pyramid we just looked at, nihilistic. Simulation replaces whatever reality once referred to, such that we now consider that there may have never been a reality. This is the exact same thing that I said. We're just, in a way we could say, we're just working out the logic. We're just instantiating the logic. This is the exact same thing I said in the humanism, transhumanism, posthumanism, whenever we were talking about, by the time you get to posthumanism, it becomes possible at an extreme level of posthumanism to think that the term human never really applied to anything, right? Okay, so I thought that this was excellent. I found this Barcode art by Scott Blake on the internet and wanted to share it with you. That image of Marilyn Monroe is completely constructed of barcodes. We have these two quotes from Baudrillard here. Perhaps it is to escape this terrifying objectivity of the world that we are currently derealizing it. Perhaps it is to escape the ultimatum of a real world that we are currently rendering it virtual. And I hope that you can hear the implications there. But basically this idea that in modernism, we were objectified. People don't really talk like that anymore, right? There was all this noise being made in modernity about, and in late modernity about objectifying people. Don't objectify somebody. But what's interesting now is that instead of saying don't objectify someone, now we're saying you need to objectify me in the way that matches my virtual objectification of myself. Compared with games, everything real is sentimental. And it is fascinating to me, this idea of game consciousness and how we went from playing video games as a kind of distraction from reality to now in postmodernity, we're asking the question, are we living in a video game? Is this whole thing just a video game? This is one of the reasons why I'm just so motivated to talk about this stuff. I hope to get back to, the more perennial types of philosophy texts and philosophers, but I just really wanted to finish getting this stuff out because I think that Baudrillard is still such a newly deceased philosopher, we might say, that a lot of people don't really understand what he was saying. And though there are videos that have been made in the past that are helpful, I feel as though they really aren't as helpful as they could be. So I'm hoping that I'm making a contribution here that is going to clarify some of these ideas for us. Okay, the treadmill example. I think that this is probably the easiest to understand, and this is one of my favorite examples. And keep in mind that this is way number 6 of the 7 ways to understand hyperreality. So, the treadmill example. We no longer walk as humans once did, right? You could say that it was necessary to walk around the environment in order to survive. So therefore, people were getting a certain number of steps in. And so we make up for this by walking on treadmills. The natural, real, day-to-day walking is replaced by the hyper-real walking that takes place on a treadmill. So if you begin to think of the implications of the treadmill example, I think yet again you can see that we are no longer relating to the territory, we're relating to the map, right? So you say something like, well, how many steps does a human need to get in? Okay, well, I'm going to go get those steps in, right? Hyperreality. Consider the extension of the treadmill example. Hyperreality may be understood by considering similar examples in particular, or by considering the cumulative effect of similar examples. Thus, it is possible to understand what Baudrillard meant. When our lives are filled with hyperreal activities, then we are living a hyperreal life. And living a hyperreal life is one way to live in a simulation. Okay, lastly, number 7 here then. So, according to Baudrillard, the perfect crime is the transformation of all our acts and all events into pure information. How many steps do I need to get in today? The final solution, the resolution of the world ahead of time by the cloning of reality, and the extermination of the real by its double. The extermination of the real by its double, by its virtual idea. Hyperreal culture, hyperreal sociality, hyperreal solidarity, hyperconformity, and terrorism. So you see, whereas in modernism, in the modern period, we were concerned with alienation, but now we are concerned with hyperconformity and terrorism. Here's another quote from Baudrillard. He says, "There is no end any longer." And I feel as though this is such a profound idea. I put together a presentation just on this to help us understand what's going on here. But he says, there will no longer be any end. History itself has become interminable. History, quote, will continue to unfold slowly, tediously, recurrently, like nails and hair continue to grow after death. So we see here in modernism the concern for the end of history and the end of everything, but in postmodernism we have eternal return and hyperreal extermination. I think again, Baudrillard has hit the bullseye. He's absolutely correct here. So lastly, it is no longer itself anything but a gigantic simulacrum. It is no longer itself. Not unreal, but a simulacrum. Not unreal, but a simulacrum. That is to say, never exchanged for the real, but exchanged for itself in an uninterrupted circuit without reference or circumference. So you could say something like, it would be as if there was some activity that was necessary for you to do, and you were just constantly caught in a distraction from that necessary activity. And oddly enough, that necessary activity might be dying, which makes me think of Plato and this definition of philosophy. That philosophy is the practice of dying. All right, so we can look here. All of these presentations have some kind of an intimate relation to hyperreality. So this talk, What Use is Truth, regarding Richard Rorty, what is psychologism, function, narration, simulation, humanism, transhumanism, posthumanism, what is nihilism, and what is postmodernism. So I have referenced all of these presentations inside of this presentation, and hopefully I'll be able to put links in the description and possibly some hyperlinks inside this video. I hope that this helps you understand hyperreality. We have discussed the 7 ways to understand hyperreality, and I think that on the one hand, the treadmill example is the easiest to understand, but we want to keep in mind this actual versus virtual and the phases of the image. Also, we want to keep in mind the final solution, of course. So hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the future.